Hello everyone and welcome to day 6 of March Mathness. The other video that I'm currently working on is taking too long to meet the daily upload schedule, so instead of rushing it out, I'm going to make this addendum to a video that I've already posted. At the end of January, I posted My Hero Academia vs. Naruto, the tournament arc. That video is currently one of my favorites that I've posted on this channel. However, I do have some pretty big issues with it. For starters, the whole title of the video, the whole concept of the video, was a comparison between the tournament arcs of My Hero Academia and Naruto. Pretty self-explanatory there. However, at the very end, I make this weird claim that you shouldn't compare the two, that it's like comparing apples to oranges, which, in my mind, sort of defeats the whole purpose of making the comparison video in the first place. At the time, I thought I knew what I was doing. I was attempting to capture this idea that both tournaments were striving to accomplish fundamentally different things. But I still feel as though saying that I can't choose one over the other as to which is a higher quality tournament, at least in the context of its own story, I feel as though that idea is a bit misguided. In one of the episodes of Hallway Chats, I forget which one it was exactly, but in that episode, Explanation Point was talking about how you know, the old phrase that you shouldn't compare apples to oranges, they're two fundamentally different things. But in that episode of Hallway Chats, he posed an interesting idea that you can compare apples to oranges because you can compare one orange to other oranges and judge it by the quality of being an orange. And likewise, you can do the same with an apple. So if I have a perfectly ripe orange versus a spoiled rotten apple, then I should theoretically be able to say that the orange is better than the apple because the orange is better at being an orange than the apple is at being an apple. Likewise, I could say the same about the two tournament arcs. They might strive to accomplish fundamentally different things at the outset, but in the context of the story as a whole, one will obviously succeed better than the other at setting up possible plot lines, or at worst, the other sets up too many ideas that it can't really live up to. And so this brings me to the conclusion that after reading some of the comments in that video and taking in a bunch of other people's feedback, taking in their perspectives, I believe that My Hero Academia's Sports Festival is a better tournament arc in the context of its story than Naruto's Chunin exams. Now hold the phone, hear me out before you go down to the comments and eviscerate me. I say this from the perspective that I've just finished rereading Naruto in its entirety, and after going through the story as a whole for the Nen show, I feel as though I have a better grasp of what exactly Kishimoto is trying to accomplish in the big picture of Naruto. And after revisiting that story, I've come to the conclusion that Naruto Part 2 is better than Naruto Part 1 for reasons that I don't really want to get into, as it will lead me on a giant tangent. But with regards to the Chunin exams, the problem with them is that Kishimoto incorporates so many ideas. Like I said in the video, the Chunin exams incorporate a lot. It was a very ambitious arc. And while the Chunin exams certainly do hold a special place in my heart for being as ambitious as they were, more ambitious than I think the sports festival was trying to be, I also believe that this ambitiousness sort of backfired in a way, because there are a lot of details in the Chunin exams that don't really ever get lived up to. There are a lot of new characters that are introduced. And while in the arc itself, it's pretty great that we have all these characters playing off of each other, so many different colorful personalities to sort of interact with, in the big picture, a lot of these characters don't live up to their potential. They just kind of show up in this arc. Many of them disappear after this. You have a guy like Rock Lee, for example, who plays a small role in the Sasuke retrieval arc without actually really accomplishing much. And then beyond that, he just disappears. He has no real staying power, no real relevance to the rest of the story. I mean, yes, he shows up, but he doesn't really accomplish anything thematically. He doesn't really do anything, have any actions that really affect the trajectory of the story. His fight with Gaara might be one of my favorite moments in a shonen story, but it's more of a standalone moment. It's not really in service of anything more with his character. In the video proper, I had criticized the sports festival for not focusing a lot of attention on the side characters, for mainly focusing on what I had said 4 big fights, and the rest just sort of being squash matches that didn't really amount to much. But in saying that, that was pretty much the intention of the sports festival. It was more so to focus on a few core ideas and keep the arc as succinct as possible. So while as a standalone arc, I suppose I could say that it's not as grandiose as the Chunin exams. It doesn't have as many ideas going into it. But because Kohei Horikoshi isn't trying to reach out into all these different plot lines and attempting to explore all these different ideas in this one arc, he has much less room for failure. The Chunin exams were definitely indicative of some of the future problems that Naruto would have with its story. Again, I go back to the bloated cast, the sheer number of characters who, especially in the preliminary fights, everybody gets their own sort of showcased fight, regardless of how important they will be to the story later on. And so by doing that, Kishimoto kind of sets up the expectation that these characters will be important to the grand narrative moving forward because they're getting all this screen time. In My Hero Academia, on the other hand, the background characters are kept mainly in the background, so while I personally might want to see more out of them in the arc, I can't really criticize Horikoshi for mishandling them when he isn't really trying to do anything grandiose with them in the first place. To reiterate my point in a new context, let's take a look at Yajirobe from Dragon Ball. I might like Yajirobe as a character, I might want to see him get more screen time, but Toriyama does not see Yajirobe as a major character. He is very clearly meant to be just a background character, just a support guy. So it seems kind of unfair for me to say, just because this character is cool, just because I might like Yajirobe as a character, that automatically means that he should have a bigger role in the story. Toriyama doesn't really set up any sort of expectations regarding Yajirobe. Most of the time when he's involved in an arc, he'll show up, deliver the senzu beans, and then just sort of get out of there, because he knows that he's a minor character, he doesn't want any involvement in the big fights, so he stays out of it. Going back to My Hero Academia, I can look at a character like Kaminari, and yeah, I might think he's pretty cool, I might want to see him have a bigger role in the story, but at least at this point in the sports festival, Horikoshi hasn't really given me any indication that Kaminari is going to have a huge impact on the story. That is very clearly not his role at this stage in the game. In Naruto, however, there are certain characters where Kishimoto seems to go out of his way to put some sort of a spotlight on. I already mentioned Rock Lee, so let's move on to somebody else. Shino. At the climax of the arc, Kishimoto has 3 different battles going on simultaneously. You have the 3rd Hokage fighting Orochimaru, you have Sasuke and later Naruto fighting Gaara, and then you've also got Shino fighting Kankuro. Now, this is mainly just an excess fight where Shino just is trying to keep Kankuro at bay, so, the main character can go on and fight the main antagonist. However, by placing the fight at this point in the arc, in this sort of timeline of events, it lends the fight perhaps a bit more weight than it actually needed. When you put this fight alongside the other 2 fights, which are the main climaxes of the arc, you've been building up Orochimaru throughout the Chunin exams, you've been building up Gaara throughout the Chunin exams. Kishimoto had also established a bit of anticipation for Kankuro and Shino as well, so by lumping all 3 of these fights together and having them happen simultaneously, it sort of implies that this fight is, if not as important, it is somewhat close to the same level of importance as the other 2. By doing it this way as well, it also sort of has some pacing problems that Kraftsdorf and I talked about in the Nen show, where the 3rd Hokage is fighting Orochimaru, the 2 get locked in this stalemate, and then we just sort of cut away from that for X number of chapters and then go back to it, and we're supposed to have the same level of emotional resonance. It's supposed to be that big payoff, but it was just sort of sitting in limbo for, several chapters, so it kind of loses that impact. A better way to do this might have been to just have Shino and Kankuro fight first, or, maybe cut away every once in a while to the other 2, just to have a bit of break in the action, but Kankuro versus Shino should have very clearly ended first before you have all this stuff going on with Gaara, Naruto, and the 3rd Hokage and Orochimaru. I don't think this was as much of an issue for Kankuro, because Kankuro shows up in several other arcs after this. He still gets a bit of time to shine. But Shino completely disappears after this arc, which is really disappointing. I know it was disappointing for me personally, because he had all of this build-up in the Chunin exams. You see his fight with Zaku, that's his name, as well as his antics in the Forest of Death. Shino just seems like an imposing figure, and it seems like Kishimoto's got some sort of a plan for this kid. But then he just sort of disappears off the face of the planet for a while, and it's, Kishimoto sort of planted the seeds for these expectations, and then just didn't decide to water them, just let them die off right there. My Hero Academia definitely plants some seeds in the sports festival, but it doesn't plant more than it needs to it. Horikoshi very clearly and deliberately sets up the plot points that he knows he's going to go back to, that he's going to expand on in future arcs, even if not immediately, but he doesn't overextend himself like I think Kishimoto does in the tuning exams. And of course, I ultimately think that this does come down to the hand that Shonen Jump, the editors, played in the progression of each individual arc. Kohei Horikoshi had wanted to write a tournament arc, and he did so with the intent of going back to revisiting it in the future. That's why it's established in the manga that the students at UA will have 3 attempts at the sports festival. So this first sports festival was mainly just the setup, something that when Horikoshi goes back to revisit it again, assuming that he does, he has much more to build off of. Think of the World Martial Arts Tournament in Dragon Ball. Toriyama didn't play all of his cards at once in the very first tournament. He very clearly had a set number of ideas he wanted to explore. He explored them in the manner that was most fitting for the story at the time, and then in future Tenkaichi Budokai arcs, he went back and made the tournament more grandiose as he revisited it. It even got to the point where in that third and final Tenkaichi Budokai arc, he was really confining himself to the rules of the tournament. He had to really bend the plot in such a way that it would still fit the rules of this tournament. If he had gone that far in just the first tournament arc, how exactly would he have built off of that? He would have been writing himself into a corner. The same goes for Horikoshi. When you look at Kishimoto and the tuning exams, however, it's a completely different story. As I said in the main video, Kishimoto's intention was not to introduce all of these characters at once, but to slowly space out their introductions over the course of several other arcs, several other missions. But the editors at Shonen Jump wanted him to do a tournament, so he had to bring them all in at once. And then, at some point as he was writing the tournament, the editors said, okay, now cut off the tournament, introduce this big bad guy, and build to this big fight at the end. And at that stage in his career, Kishimoto did not have the same experience of being a mangaka that he did in Part 2, which is why I think it's very clear when you go back and revisit Naruto that, at least as far as introducing different plot elements are concerned, Part 2 is much more cohesive. There are certainly still ideas that get set up but not really delivered on, but Kishimoto, at least as far as the plot structure is concerned, a lot of his details are very deliberate. He sets up the Akatsuki at the beginning of Part 2, and they basically carry the rest of the story beyond that. When a mysterious character like Toby's secret identity is revealed, there is very clear foreshadowing leading up to it, details that can indicate that yes, this is who this character is. When a character like Madara Uchiha is introduced, he has been established, he has been talked about multiple times over the course of the story leading up to it. And so whether or not Kishimoto had planned all of this from the beginning, at the very least, when he has to sort of take the story in a different direction, he has been writing for so long that he has a better idea of where to go with it. Unlike with the tuning exams, which I feel as though was more so just Kishimoto experimenting with trying to get a grasp of all these different concepts. Over the course of just Naruto alone, I do feel as though he did learn from these mistakes. He did figure out how to kind of work around them when introducing newer characters at least. But for the Naruto narrative as a whole, all of these characters were already introduced, so the only real solution would have been to kill them all off to try to erase that baggage, but that wouldn't really work with the tone of Naruto. So Kishimoto had already sort of dug his own grave by that point. There wasn't really much that he could do to salvage the mess that he had made in Part 1. I think what I was trying to get at in the main video was that the tuning exams as like a standalone might feel more entertaining because of how grandiose it is, because of how many different ideas are thrown into it. But while I certainly think that you can view a single story arc in a vacuum and get entertainment out of that, when judging it critically, I do feel as though you need to take the rest of the narrative. You need to take the story as a whole into consideration when evaluating the story. And I personally just feel as though Horikoshi was a bit smarter with keeping the scope of the sports festival a lot smaller. It might have been less ambitious, and I certainly do respect Kishimoto for trying something different, trying to incorporate all of these different ideas into one story, because that sounds like something I would do. In the wrestling videos that I make on my other channel, I like to have a massive roster. I like to work with a lot of different characters, so that way I can kind of intertwine these stories in and out of each other. I can move pieces around the chessboard, so to speak. I like getting involved with a lot of different plot lines, so from that perspective, I definitely can empathize with Kishimoto in having all these different characters and trying to bounce them off of each other, trying to explore all these different ideas in this one arc. It's not something that's easy to do, but again, that does set up a lot of room for failure, a lot of room for shortcomings, and I do feel as though the Chunin exams do fall quite short, especially in the grand scheme of the narrative. At one point, I might have thought that the Chunin exams were the best arc in Naruto, but after revisiting the story as a whole, I definitely don't think that. I think that Kishimoto has written much better arcs in time after the Chunin exams, and definitely as a whole, I think Part 2 is much more cohesive. It tells a much more cohesive story than that of Part 1. If I wanted to talk about that more in detail, that would easily make for a separate video, though. However, if you do want to hear me talk more about Naruto in revisiting the story as a whole, you can go check out the Nen Show podcast with myself and Craftsdwarf. We went back and revisited the entire manga. We've completed it. We're about to start Bleach next, so get your glasses of Bleach ready. Yes, I know, it's a dated meme. But thank you for joining me for day 6 of March Madness. If you haven't really been paying attention, if this is the first video from this challenge you've seen of me, I definitely recommend you go check out the Legacy of me and Mathwiz to get a better understanding of what I'm doing this month, because some people haven't seen that video and they have no clue what's going on. Rest assured, I will have some actual scripted content coming out this month. Naturally, that takes more time to put together and edit the whole project, so those will be coming out in much shorter supply, but I do have some scripted videos that will be coming out, and I do have plenty of other videos that will be actually edited coming out this month, but on the daily upload schedule, you're kind of restricted as far as time is concerned, so there wasn't a whole lot I could do for this one. Rather, I suppose that I just sort of threw this video under the bus to save time for other projects. Anyways, that's enough for today. I'll catch you tomorrow, or some other day if you don't watch tomorrow's video. In that case, I'll catch you in the future.